January 1957. Atlanta, Georgia. Winter rain tapped softly against the narrow windows of the United States Penitentiary, blurring the world beyond thick concrete walls. Inside, fluorescent lights hum with a low, unbroken sound. Metal bunks line the cell blocks. The air smells faintly of disinfectant, damp wool, and stale tobacco. Men move through routines measured not in hours, but in sentences. Years reduce to numbers. Numbers reduce to silence. In a small room away from the general population, paper forms are stacked neatly on a desk. Government seals press dark ink into white margins. A metal tray holds cups of clear liquid, indistinguishable from water. No weapons are visible. No restraints are required. The power here is quieter than violence, and far more precise. One inmate steps forward. James Whitey Bulger, convicted bank robber, career criminal, 33 years old. He is told this is a medical experiment. He is told it may shorten his sentence. He is not told who truly sponsors it or why his mind, rather than his body, has become valuable. Outside these walls, the United States stand victorious from a world war. Inside them, a new conflict has already begun, one fought in secrecy, chemistry, and the human brain. In the years after the Second World War, the United States emerged not only intact, but ascendant. Its cities stood unbombed. Its factories ran at full capacity. Its military footprint stretched across oceans and continents. Yet victory carried a shadow. The war had ended, but peace did not arrive with it. Instead, a new struggle took shape, quieter, colder, and defined less by territory than by influence, ideology, and fear. By 1947, former allies had become adversaries. The Soviet Union consolidated power across Eastern Europe. Communist parties expanded their reach in Asia. Intelligence reports warn of a world divided not by borders, but by belief systems. American policymakers spoke openly of infiltration, subversion, and psychological warfare. The battlefield was no longer only land, sea, and air. It was the human mind. During the final months of World War II, Allied forces uncovered disturbing evidence inside defeated Nazi Germany. Laboratories once hidden within hospitals and universities revealed experiments conducted without consent. Research into hypnosis, chemical incapacitation, sensory deprivation. The goal had not been healing, but control. Similar fears surrounded Soviet research programs, rumored to be advancing rapidly behind the Iron Curtain. In Washington, these discoveries did not inspire condemnation alone. They provoked urgency. The newly formed Central Intelligence Agency inherited not only the responsibility of gathering intelligence, but the anxiety of falling behind. American planners worried that enemies might develop techniques capable of breaking prisoners without torture, extracting secrets without violence, or reshaping loyalty itself. The question was no longer whether such methods were ethical. It was whether they were possible, and if so, whether the United States could afford not to understand them. By the early 1950s, this concern had hardened into policy. Classified programs multiplied. Behavioral scientists, chemists, and psychiatrists were quietly recruited. Universities, hospitals, and prisons became research sites. Funding flowed through layers of front organizations, obscuring its origin. Among the substances attracting attention was a compound discovered in Switzerland in 1938 and largely unknown to the public, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. Early reports described profound alterations of perception, identity, and time itself. To intelligence officials, the implications were staggering. A drug that could dissolve resistance, distort memory, or fracture personality seemed to offer access to the deepest defenses of the human psyche. Experiments began cautiously, then aggressively. Soldiers, patients, students, prisoners. Consent was often partial, sometimes non-existent. Federal prisons, in particular, offer controlled population, isolated, documented, and disposable in ways rarely spoken aloud. Inmates were promised incentives, reduced sentences, better conditions, small payments. Their participation was framed as service, even patriotism. What was withheld were the true risks, the sponsoring agencies, and the long-term consequences. By the time James Bulger encountered those paper cups in Atlanta, the experiment was already well underway. shaped by fear, ambition, and the unresolved moral debris of a global war. By 1953, the search for psychological dominance had acquired an official name, Project MKUltra, authorized under CIA Director Allen Dulles. The program was not a single experiment, but a sprawling network of subprojects, over 100 by some later counts, spread across institutions that appeared ordinary on the surface. Its stated objective was vague by design, to explore methods of influencing human behavior. Its real ambition reached far deeper. Internal memoranda spoke of interrogation resistance, mind fragmentation, and chemical means of inducing compliance. The language was clinical, detached from human consequence. LSD became central to this pursuit not because it guaranteed control, but because it offered unpredictability. Intelligence officers believed that within chaos might lie a method to disorient enemies, disrupt loyalties, or unlock confessions without physical coercion. At the same time, the American prison system was expanding rapidly. Post-war crime waves, stricter sentencing, and federal enforcement initiatives filled penitentiaries across the country. These institutions existed outside public view, governed by bureaucratic routine and limited oversight. For researchers operating under classified authority, they presented a population that could be studied repeatedly with minimal external scrutiny. The experiments at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta were formally described as research into schizophrenia and mental illness. Inmates were told the program was overseen by medical professionals. In truth, it was part of a CIA-funded initiative, channeled through the Bureau of Prisons and individual researchers whose work intersected with intelligence interests. Records would later show that LSD was administered in high doses, repeatedly, sometimes for weeks at a time. James Bulger volunteered in 1957. His decision, like many others, was shaped by calculation rather than trust. Reduced sentences were a powerful incentive, so it was the illusion of agency. What Bulger and fellow participants were not informed of was the experimental nature of the dosing, the absence of therapeutic intent, or the long-term neurological and psychological risks involved. Decades later, Bulger would describe the experience as deeply traumatic. He claimed the drug produced vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and episodes of dissociation that lingered long after the experiments ended. Some of these claims align with known effects of prolonged LSD exposure. Others remain impossible to verify fully, due in part to the destruction of MKUltra records ordered in 1973, just as congressional scrutiny intensified. What survives are fragments, declassified files, Senate testimony, and the accounts of subjects whose memories were altered by design. Together, they reveal a program born from fear of external enemies, sustained by secrecy, and carried out on citizens stripped of meaningful choice. Within that system, individuals like Bulger were not anomalies. They were variables. And it is through those variables that the deeper consequences of the experiment begin to surface, not only in laboratories and reports, but in the lives shaped afterward by what was taken and what was never returned. The first angle is human, and it begins with the logic of selection. Federal prisoners were not chosen at random, but for their isolation from public sympathy. Convicted criminals occupied a space where rights existed in theory, but were easily bent in practice. Within the culture of the 1950s justice system, their suffering rarely translated into scrutiny. Participation in experiments was framed as opportunity rather than coercion. The imbalance of power was structural, and it was absolute. The second angle is psychological. LSD was not merely a chemical curiosity. By the mid-1950s, psychiatrists understood that it could dismantle the boundary between perception and reality. Time stretched, identity fractured, thought patterns looped and collapsed. For intelligence agencies, this was not a flaw, it was a point. A subject destabilized by perception might be more vulnerable to suggestion, more pliable under questioning. The problem was control. LSD did not produce obedience. It produced exposure. A third angle emerges through documentation. Surviving records indicate that inmates in Atlanta were dosed repeatedly, sometimes daily, for extended periods. The goal was endurance, how long the mind could be kept in an altered state without complete breakdown. Medical oversight existed, but it served observation, not protection. The data collected focused on reactions, resistance, and recovery time rather than well-being. The fourth angle is moral, and it sits uncomfortably beneath the language of national security. The United States had prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg less than a decade earlier for human experimentation without consent. Yet here, consent was redefined through paperwork and incentives. Disclosure was partial. Sponsorship was hidden. Risk was minimized in description, but magnified in reality. The ethical lines drawn in wartime tribunals blurred quickly in peacetime laboratories. Finally, there is the personal trajectory. Bulger entered the program as a career criminal, already shaped by violence, loyalty, and control. He would later claim that the experiments intensified traits that already existed. Paranoia sharpened, empathy eroded, trust dismantled. Whether the experiments created these changes or merely amplified them remains debated. What is not debated is that the state intervened directly in his inner life, without accountability and without a plan for repair. These angles do not compete. They overlap, reinforcing a pattern in which fear justified secrecy. Secrecy enabled harm, and harm disappeared into classification. Another angle is institutional, and it reveals how responsibility dissolved across layers of authority. No single individual designed MKUltra in full, and that diffusion was deliberate. Researchers answered to grant administrators. Administrators answered to agencies. Agencies answered only to classified directives. When harm occurred, it was absorbed by the system rather than owned by a person. This structure allowed experiments to continue even when doubts surfaced, because stopping them required consensus that secrecy prevented. A further angle is technological, rooted in the post-war belief that science itself could deliver strategic supremacy. Radar, the atomic bomb, and code-breaking had all altered the outcome of World War II. Behavioral science was seen as the next frontier. If technology could split the atom, perhaps it could also split allegiance. LSD, inexpensive and potent, seemed to offer leverage disproportionate to its size. A few micrograms promised access to the deepest mechanisms of thought. There is also an enemy-centered angle. American intelligence assessments during the early Cold War frequently overstated Soviet capabilities, but those exaggerations shaped policy. Reports suggested that communist regimes were developing advanced interrogation techniques, capable of producing false confessions or total compliance. Whether true or not, the belief alone was enough. MKUltra was as much a reaction to imagined threats as documented ones. Another perspective lies in the silence that followed. For years, participants spoke rarely, and when they did, their credibility was questioned. Criminal records undermined testimony. Psychological damage complicated memory. Without documentation, individuals' suffering remained anecdotal. It was not until the 1970s, when Senate investigations forced partial disclosure, that the scope of the program became visible. Even then, much had already been erased. The final angle is symbolic, and it centers on the paper cup. It appears in records only indirectly, but it recurs in memory. A small, disposable object, easily replaced, holding a substance that permanently altered perception. It represented trust without transparency, medicine without healing, and authority without oversight. Each cup was an assertion of power, quietly extended and rarely questioned. All of these angles converge toward a single moment. The point at which experimentation ceased to be theoretical and became irreversible, not only for the subjects, but for the institutions that would later be forced to confront what had been done. The turning point does not arrive with a single scream or collapse. It arrives gradually, through accumulation. Days measured not by calendars, but by doses. At the Atlanta Penitentiary, the routine of administration stripped the extraordinary of its warning signs. LSD was delivered again and again, the intervals narrowing, the effects compounding. Records indicate that some inmates remained under the influence for most of their waking hours over extended periods. Observation replaced caution. Endurance replaced ethics. Physiological responses were logged with precision. Elevated heart rates, disrupted sleep, extended confusion. Psychological reactions were noted in colder terms. Disorganization of thought, emotional volatility, detachment from reality. The language avoided judgment. It did not ask whether the subject was harmed. It asked whether the subject persisted. For Bulger, This phase would later become central to his account. He described an erosion of internal boundaries, a sense that perception could no longer be trusted. Paranoia was not episodic. It was constant. Whether these descriptions reflect accurate memory or retrospective interpretation is difficult to determine. LSD's known effects include both acute hallucination and longer-term alterations in anxiety and cognition, particularly when administered repeatedly without therapeutic context. What is documented is that the program pushed beyond initial expectations. LSD did not produce reliable compliance. Instead, it revealed instability. Subject became unpredictable, emotionally exposed, and in some cases resistant rather than submissive. From an intelligence standpoint, this was failure. From a human standpoint, it was damage. The internal reassessment did not lead to immediate termination. Instead, it shifted emphasis. Researchers focused less on interrogation utility and more on mapping psychological thresholds. How much could the mind absorb before fragmenting? How long before recovery became uncertain? These questions were not framed in public documents, but their implications are visible in the dosing patterns. The climax, then, is not a revelation, but a realization, quiet, bureaucratic, and deeply consequential. The experiment had crossed from exploration into exploitation, and once crossed, there was no mechanism to reverse what had already been altered. The second phase of the climax sharpens the intensity of what had begun quietly. By mid-1957, James Bulger and several other inmates had endured successive doses of LSD for weeks. The sessions were carefully timed, recorded, and monitored. Observers noted slurred speech, erratic movement, and prolonged silence, often punctuated by sudden, incomprehensible laughter or violent agitation. Each reaction was cataloged as data, stripped of empathy or context. The laboratory mindset dominated the cell block. During one series of sessions, reports indicate that subjects exhibited dissociation so profound that they could no longer distinguish the prison walls from imagined spaces. Time fractured into loops. Hallucinations of other inmates, guards, and even abstract shapes filled perception. In these moments, the distinction between subject and observer blurred. Researchers, bound by classification and method, documented everything, but never intervened unless safety thresholds were breached. The threshold itself was undefined, subjective, and terrifyingly malleable. Bulger's personal account, later corroborated in part by declassified documents, describes an internal struggle to maintain identity amid persistent disorientation. He recalls vivid sensory distortions, colors that breathed, voices that echoed from invisible sources, and sensations of weightless floating followed by sudden gravitational collapse. Some of these experiences lasted hours. Others extended across days. Sleep cycles were disrupted. Memory became unreliable. Emotion responses oscillated between euphoria and despair with alarming unpredictability. This period represents a profound shift in both human and institutional perception. From the perspective of the CIA and the overseeing researchers, it confirmed the drug's capacity to destabilize. Yet the desired effect, predictable obedience, or insight into hidden loyalties, remained elusive. The mind proved more resilient and more complex than any theoretical model. For the inmates, it became a crucible, testing endurance, sanity, and the very essence of self. By the end of this phase, Bulger emerged markedly changed. Whether psychologically, emotionally, or morally, the intervention had left a permanent imprint. Subsequent years would show echoes of these experiences in his behavior. Heightened paranoia, strategic manipulation, and a capacity for ruthlessness noted by associates and investigators alike. The laboratory created a living record of transformation, one that was impossible to contain, destined to ripple far beyond the walls of Atlanta. The turning point concludes with an unsettling realization. The experiment did not simply study human behavior. It altered it. The next stage reveals how these alterations extended into consequence, reputation, and historical record. The aftermath of the experiment at Atlanta was measured not in headlines, but in long shadows. At the time, the program continued quietly, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. Prisoners returned to daily routines, yet nothing within the penitentiary would ever feel ordinary again. James Bulger walked the corridors not only as a convicted criminal, but as a subject of a clandestine war waged on the mind. The line between voluntary participation and coerced exposure had already blurred, leaving psychological fractures that would persist for decades. From the institutional perspective, early evaluations were cautiously optimistic. Reports claimed that some subjects displayed heightened suggestibility or compliance under observation, though these results were inconsistent. Where predictions had failed, data were interpreted as anomalies or dismissed entirely. The agencies overseeing the work remained invested, eager to justify continued funding and to demonstrate that lessons had been learned without attracting public scrutiny. Yet the wider consequences extended beyond immediate research goals. Inmates who survived repeated LSD sessions reported long-term effects, recurring paranoia, insomnia, anxiety, and in some cases, persistent hallucinations. Bulger himself later described an acute awareness of manipulation, a constant calculation of trust and betrayal. Traits that may have been latent, distrust, cunning, strategic aggression, were amplified. What had been framed as an experiment for national security became, in effect, a crucible of personality transformation. Public knowledge of these programs remained minimal until the mid-1970s, when Senate committees and investigative journalists began uncovering evidence of MKUltra. Hundreds of pages of documentation, partially destroyed, revealed the breadth of experimentation. Prison systems, hospitals, universities, and unwitting civilians. The narrative shifted from clandestine science to ethical scandal. Bulger's participation became a symbol of how the government's pursuit of knowledge could override human rights. The institutional aftermath also had legal and moral dimensions. Laws and protocols governing human experimentation were strengthened, and oversight became more stringent. The very term consent acquired new weight in research ethics. Yet the individuals directly affected, those who had been exposed without full understanding, remained largely uncompensated and largely invisible. The psychological cost was personal, permanent, and largely unquantifiable. Across the intelligence community, MKUltra left a paradoxical legacy. While the program failed to produce a reliable method of mind control, it successfully demonstrated the limitations of human manipulation, the ethical cost of secrecy, and the fragility of trust between citizen and state. For Bulger and others, the experience was a private history of coercion, endurance, and adaptation. The prison walls contained more than criminals. They held a laboratory of human resilience and vulnerability, where the consequences of unchecked authority were etched in the minds of its subjects. By the late 1950s, the experiments had officially concluded at Atlanta, but their effects radiated outward in ways that were subtle, persistent, and unsettling. Inmates like James Bulger were released back into society, yet the experiences they had endured remained embedded in perception, cognition, and behavior. For Bulger, the psychological imprint of repeated LSD exposure intersected with an already complex personality, one forged in the harsh realities of crime, survival, and incarceration. The experiment had acted as both lens and amplifier, sharpening paranoia, intensifying strategic thinking, and fostering a heightened awareness of manipulation that would shadow his every action. On a broader scale, the release of information decades later exposed the systemic recklessness of MKUltra. Congressional investigations in 1975, spearheaded by the Church Committee, revealed that hundreds of unwitting participants across the United States had been subjected to experimentation under false pretenses. Thousands of documents had been destroyed in 1973 on orders from the CIA, a calculated effort to erase evidence. Nevertheless, surviving records confirmed the depth of oversight lapses, ethical violations, and long-term harm caused by these experiments. Bulger's personal trajectory became, in retrospect, intertwined with this history of secrecy and manipulation. He emerged as a figure capable of operating in shadows, understanding leverage, and anticipating human behavior with unnerving precision. Observers later noted his capacity for calculated aggression, loyalty, and survival, traits arguably sharpened by the intrusive, destabilizing experience of mind-altering experimentation. The state had attempted to mold the mind. In some ways, it had succeeded in a form the planners had neither anticipated nor desired. Symbolically, the paper cups used to administer LSD persisted in collective memory as a quiet representation of power and control. They were mundane objects, ordinary in appearance, yet their contents wielded the authority of the state over thought itself. Each cup contained a promise and a threat, simultaneously offering release and imposing constraint. They became icons of a program in which the boundaries between consent, coercion, and exploitation were deliberately obscured. The historical aftermath of the experiments illustrates a profound tension, the ambition of a democratic state seeking security, colliding with the vulnerabilities of its own citizens. The lessons were recorded in reports, in testimony, and in the altered behaviors of those subjected to chemical influence. They would inform ethical codes, research protocols, and intelligence policies for decades, but they could not erase the human cost, nor the enduring question of how far a nation may go in pursuit of perceived safety. In the quiet decades that followed, the story of James Whitey Bulger and the experiments at Atlanta became more than an account of chemical intervention. It became a mirror reflecting the limits of authority, the fragility of trust, and the human cost of secrecy. A paper cup, small, unassuming, ordinary, symbolized a collision of power and vulnerability, the way an institution could bend perception and manipulate thought without leaving visible scars. Yet the most profound effects were invisible: altered minds, recalibrated instincts, and lives marked by experiences that could never be fully understood or undone. The experiments reveal a truth that transcends any single subject or program. The pursuit of control, even in the name of national security, exact a toll on those subjected and on the society that sanctions it. Bulger emerged from this crucible transformed, not simply by criminal inclination, but by an intimate encounter with the deliberate shaping of thought itself. It is a reminder that freedom, once compromised, even in a laboratory, casts a long shadow. Ultimately, these events challenge the notion that victory, safety, or knowledge can ever justify the violation of conscience. They remind us that abundance, in resources, technology, or authority, is only meaningful when tempered by ethics. The LSD, the papers, the recorded observations, the silent cells, they are more than historical artifacts. They are a testament to a paradox of modern power, that the tools designed to protect can also corrupt, and that the most profound conflicts may unfold not on distant battlefields, but within the human mind. History preserved them not as spectacle, but as warning. And in that preservation, the quiet, humming fluorescent lights of a penitentiary in 1957 still echo, carrying lessons about vigilance, morality, and the cost of experimentation on the fragile architecture of the self.